Hello everyone and welcome to this chess strategy video entitled Capablanca Magic. So in this game, Capablanca, one of the greatest chess players of all time, had the white pieces, and we see here he scored a 97% accurate game versus his opponent who scored 90.4. So here today we'll discuss strategy. I had some requests for that from viewers. So let's begin here. The game started, well, before I begin, this was a 1941 game, maybe one of the last games that Capablanca played before he passed away. Let's see what happened. All right, if we look at the analysis, the game began with d4, d5. So strategy wise, when you start with the D pawn, the games tend to be more strategic in nature. The position can be more closed. As opposed to E4, where the games will be more tactical, they'll tend to open up in the center and have more room for the pieces to maneuver and attack. The D pawn openings are kind of the opposite of that. So you'll see here. Now, Capablanca, he plays knight to f3 to bolster this d pawn, to cover this e5 square, and just to develop a piece. So his opponent copies him, doing the same. And now we have e3 here. So this sets up the Kali system, which is another strategy that you can use in chess where instead of trying to memorize a bunch of moves in the opening, you can set up a system where you almost always make the same moves in the beginning, in the opening. You'll kind of put the d pawn out here to d4, the e pawn to e3, a knight to f3, a bishop to d3, and the other knight to d2. So this is a system opening where you just follow a system of setting up your pieces, and you kind of almost do that no matter what your opponent does. But you always kind of have to keep an eye on what they're doing in case they do something that attacks a piece. So moving on, we have c6 here. So this just fortifies the d pawn, and just strengthens the center here. It may be a little bit of a passive move, because a lot of times this c pawn can be pushed forward to attack the d pawn here, but his opponent is playing more conservatively and strategic. So Capablanca just continues with the Kali system setup, just bringing the bishop out here to d3, where it can fire up here towards the king side, maybe produce some threats later in the game. So now the opponent also develops his light square bishop, pinning the knight to the queen, and now we have c4. So another strategy, a common strategy, whenever you have d4, d5, a lot of times the c pawns are used to press forward and counterattack your opponent's d pawn. So sometimes it can be a mistake to jump your knight up here to c3 before this c pawn is moved in these d4, d5 openings. So just keep that in mind. This pawn could also have played passively and gone here to c3, but on c4, this less valuable pawn on the c file attacks this very valuable pawn here on d5. So in response, e6 is played just to further bolster this d pawn, and also it gives black the option to where if he wouldn't have moved this pawn and white captured, well, then black would capture and the game would be more symmetrical. But now black has the option that if white captures on d5, he can also capture with this e pawn and gain a half open file down the center of the board here. That he could influence this e file, whereas white may not be able to do that because this e pawn is blocking the e file. But of course, white would have more power on this half open c file once this c pawn moves out of the way. But this is a c file, and the e file that black would try and control is in the center. And in general, you want to try and control the center of the board more than your opponent. All right, so moving on, white just continues his development. Now, if the knight is captured, he has the option of recapturing with the knight or with the queen, because this knight also works with the bishop to keep an eye on this e4 square. Now the knight can't jump in there, or the knight would capture, and if pawn recaptures, the bishop would gain a pawn here on e4. So it just keeps an eye on the e4 square. All right, black does the same, developing his knight, fortifying his other knight, and also keeping an eye on the e5 square. So Capablanca just goes ahead and castles, getting his king to safety, preparing to get this rook closer to the center, or he could leave the rook here and back up the f pawn and maybe push this f pawn forward. So that's another option. Now we have bishop to e7. So black just develops the bishop and gets ready to castle as well. And so the game continues with both sides just developing pieces. A lot of times the queen will develop here to c2. It can back up the bishop and create a battery aiming up here towards the king side. Also, if the c pawn captures in the center, maybe queen and rook could form a battery up this half open c file. Or if black captures with his c pawn, there could be a battle for the c file. All right, so now because this bishop is no longer pinning the knight to the queen, as the queen has just moved to c2, the bishop retreats back, where possibly he can move back to g6 and fight for these light squares against white's bishop here on d3. So now this is another strategy where we see that the d pawn and the c pawn are attacking each other. So Capablanca moves up his b pawn, which is not doing much here, and he pushes it up to fortify this c pawn so that if black captures, he could recapture with the b pawn and have a stronger group of central pawns here. And also, maybe his bishop can maneuver now to b2 or a3, although not immediately with a3, as this bishop would just capture him. But anyway, moving on, the black bishop here retreats. This light squared bishop moves to g6 and battles the bishop here on d3. Now, another piece of chess strategy is the concept of good and bad bishops. A good bishop, like white's here, is on the opposite color squares of his central pawns. So his central pawns are on the dark squares, and we see how they block in his own dark squared bishop. Whereas this good bishop can maneuver around these central pawns. Now, although this c pawn is blocking his path a little bit, we're mostly worried about these two central pawns, the d and e pawns. So here, black's bad bishop would be happy to exchange off for white's good bishop here, because this black bishop, or this light squared black bishop, is off to the side. So it is unobstructed by its central pawns because it got out early and was able to get outside of this pawn chain. But anyway, moving on, we'll see what happens here shortly. Capablanca just continues to develop his bad bishop here along this diagonal, thinking that another piece of chess strategy is that no matter how blocked a position is, you never know when the position might just open up and pieces might be traded out of the way, and a blocked in piece like this bishop, if these pawns are exchanged in the middle later in the game, this bishop could become very strong once it has an open line here aimed towards the king side. And that also goes with rooks, queens, any long range pieces, especially if you put a rook here on e1 and it aims up the board at the king. Well, right now you have pawns and a bishop, pieces in the way, but you never know when they might be exchanged off, and then you might have a long range piece in a good attacking position. So black exchanges off his bad bishop for white's good bishop. So he was probably happy to do that. And as Capablanca was one of the greatest players in the world, black also uses another strategy of trading away material if you're in a more cramped position. So black's position is just a little more cramped than Capablanca's. So if you are in the cramped position, it can it can be good for you to trade off pieces, because then the remaining pieces have more room in that cramped position. And then the opposite for the side with more room. If they have a lot of space, but then they trade off all their pieces, they have a lot of open space that's going to be harder to guard from your opponent because you traded off most of your defenders of all that space. So moving on, we have castling here, and now Capablanca, an interesting move here. He swings this rook all the way over and blocks in his other rook. So he wants to fortify this e-pawn and be able to push it forward. But he probably decided to leave this f-pawn because he may want to push the f-pawn as well. And so, that's a decision you'll have to make as you're playing, where to put your rooks, like what squares will be best for your rooks. And it all depends on how the pawns have been moved in front of the rooks. You want to place your rooks on open files if that's possible, or half open files. And then if there are no open or half open files like this game here, the next best thing is to put your rooks in behind pawns that have been moved forward or that you plan to move forward. So Capablanca is probably planning to push this e-pawn, and maybe he left this rook on the f-file because he might want to push his f-pawn. So now his opponent develops the queen, connects the rooks, and so his rooks are ready to be moved to wherever he needs to put them to gain the most advantage. So now, finally, we see that the rook was moved to e1 to help push this pawn forward. And another strategy in chess is that whenever your opponent has a good pawn formation like this, 2 or here 3 pawns, it's usually a good idea to try and knock those pawns out. So we see here immediately Capablanca's opponent plays the best move, which is to just knock out one of the central pawns. It's an even trade. The knight recaptures here, attacking the f6 knight of his opponent. And we see Capablanca just has a little bit of space with these 2 E and C pawns, cramping black's position a little bit, and his opponent, Capablanca, has pushed his pawns forward. So Capablanca, if we look at the evaluation, he has a slight advantage here, white. Not much, but he's a little ahead. So black continues this strategy of trading off material, to try and lessen Capablanca's attacking options. So this was interesting. The rook captured instead of the queen, which now this rook would be able to swing over here in front of the king. So by lifting this rook up here and giving it the option to swing over to the king side, Capablanca has an extra attacking piece. For example, he could swing over to g4 and try and put pressure on the king, and the bishop is kind of lined up on the g pawn. But anyway, moving forward, we have this bishop moving here to f6 to try and fight for this diagonal, which if white had pushed this pawn forward, it would activate this bishop, and it could fire up here and attack at black's king side. So Capablanca plays queen to e3, just moving his queen out of the way here, backing up the rook, helping to guard this e5 square. So perhaps black wanted to push this pawn forward, but now Capablanca has an extra piece guarding this e5 square. And so the game continues with c5 being played. So now black decides to push the c pawn, which is the best move in this position. So you have a less valuable pawn on the side attacking the more valuable central square here, or central pawn. And knight to e5. So the computer preferred g4 here, just marching forward and maybe attacking the bishop by pushing this pawn all the way up to g5. But Capablanca plays knight to e5 here, and it looks like capture in the center was played by Capablanca's opponent, and the computer instead prefers, if we go back, instead of that pawn capture, it looks like just moving the rook over here to this half open file and putting more pressure down the center of the board. That's what the computer prefers, and it looks like that move would have kept the game pretty much dead even. But we have capture of the pawn in the center, and this is an inaccuracy, and it gives an advantage to white now by almost half a pawn, well, a little over half a pawn's worth of material. So after this interesting move, Capablanca just leaves his queen under attack here. So take a look at that, see if you can figure out why he did that. Well, we'll take a look here and see, what would happen if this pawn were to be captured here. All right, so it looks like after capture, well, then it would allow this right here, and we see that if this knight is captured, it would allow a mate in 2. So if we have capture, the rook would move over and check, the king would have to move, and then the bishop would deliver a mate here. So obviously that could not be played after knight captures. You would have to go king to h8, but that would keep white in the lead, and it would allow a rook move here, threatening mate by capturing on h7. So h6 would have to be played, but now the rook could capture anyway, forcing a capture, and now the knight would have a discovered attack once it moves. The bishop would have a discovered attack after this knight would move. So knight to e8, discovered attack, checking the king, and the queen can be captured next. So the king would have to move, the queen could be captured, and then this pawn could threaten to push forward attacking here, and the rook would have to block. But now we have this threat moving over, threatening to move the rook down the board to d1. So in order to stop this threat, because if this rook makes it to d1, white cannot capture it, or the pawn would recapture and promote. So white is forced to play f4. So now if the rook comes down to d1, the king could just move over and guard the rook here on e1. So, the game could continue like this, attacking. The bishop would move, the pawn could be captured, the king would come up, and now they could capture this passed pawn here. And you get the idea. So here, white would be in the lead, and Capablanca's opponent was smart about it, and he avoided that. So if we go back here after knight to e5, and then we have the pawn capture attacking the queen, and that is when Capablanca captured here. And in the game, the continuation was queen takes d7, and it looks like then we had, let's see, bishop captures on d4, capture, capture. So Capablanca's opponent was probably anxious to just trade down material. So if we take a look at things here, we see that material is even. We have 4 pawns on this side, 2 over here. So 6 pawns versus 6 pawns. 2 rooks and queen versus a likewise amount of material. But some of the major differences here are Capablanca already having his queen and his rook out here and attacking, and so black will have to retreat his queen, and that could give Capablanca time to develop his other rook. Also, a very big strategic point in this game is that on the king side, black has a majority, 4 pawns versus 3, but on the queen side, Capablanca has the majority of 3 versus 2. And whenever you have a majority, especially on the queen side here, it's usually a good idea to push the unopposed pawn forward, which Capablanca has already started to do here, because that pawn can more easily push up the board because it doesn't have a pawn opposing it in front of it. So let's take a look here and see what Capablanca did, how he played on. The game looks pretty even, but Capablanca was an endgame magician, and it was very interesting. If you want to learn about strategy, especially how to win games that look like they're about even, they look like they're going to be a draw. Magnus Carlsen is also very good at this, but his games can be more complicated, whereas Capablanca, he's a good, one of the greatest chess players from the past that you can go through his games and just see how he plays, and you can learn a lot. So the queen has to move out of the way. This allows Capablanca to double his rooks. Another important strategy, whenever you get a chance to double your rooks, especially on an open file, they can have a lot of influence on that file and also the game. So now we have a battle here. If your opponent has doubled rooks and he's trying to just take control of the center like this, you should do what you can to stop that from happening. So black immediately fights for control here of this open d file. And the game continues with b4. So Capablanca trying to use his queenside pawn majority, pushing this b pawn, which will allow the c pawn to push forward here. So capture by the queen, which helps guard this pawn, but it also doubles the queen and the rook, and kind of takes control here. Now the black's rook cannot move here to the center, otherwise it would just be captured. So we have b6, which tries to limit the forward momentum of this majority of pawns here, but now Capablanca just plays g3. So another good piece of strategy, especially in the end game, when your king, if we go back one move, we see that white's king is kind of blocked in by his own pawns, and by moving this pawn forward, it gives a little bit of room and space here for this king to escape in case there are any back rank threats, any attacks, because you don't want to be winning a game and then lose to a back rank checkmate. So doubling of the rooks here, trying to put pressure on this c pawn, and now white just moves over and protects this pawn, and the game continues with black now attacking the queen, and the queen retreats to e3. Now the computer preferred queen to e4 here, but perhaps Capablanca moved back here to prevent any chance of this rook jumping down to the second rank, the seventh rank for black, and attacking this a pawn and just causing problems. So now the queen moves towards the center. And often a good strategy in the endgame is to use your king, because once a lot of the pieces are traded off of the board, the king becomes more valuable. But that can be risky when there are still queens on the board. So, I would caution you to be careful about moving your king out to the center of the board if there's still queens on the board that can zip all over the board and attack, as we'll see what happens here. The computer preferred h6, just leaving the king back here in the corner where it's protected, but giving it room, like white did here, a little escape hatch by pushing h6. But in the game, the king moved here, and this was an inaccuracy, and now white is ahead by half a pawn's worth of material. And finally, the c pawn that's unopposed pushes forward, and of course black captures that, the best move. We have here the queen ignoring this here, not capturing with the pawn, just repositioning the queen up to the center of the board and threatening to just capture this pawn over here. But now also there could be possible, problems with this queen in the center. That's often a good strategy. You want to put your queen in the center where it can control a lot of area. But from here, if this pawn, b pawn, pushes up, the queen could try and move over here to c6 at some point, attacking black's queen and threatening to push this pawn up. But anyway, the game continues with rook to d5 here, just protecting. And also black, if we go back one, black cannot capture, of course, this b pawn, or the rook would just capture the queen. So the rook moves down here to help protect this c pawn. And now we have capture, the best move in the game, and g6 is played, and this is an inaccuracy, giving white even more of an advantage with +1. So if we go back, it looks like the computer wanted rook to just capture immediately, but or excuse me, let me take a look at that. The computer did not want this move. This would be a mistake. So if I go back, it looks like, let's see here, capture by white in the game. G6 was played. The computer says that queen to c5 or c6 here, moving the queen forward and blockading this passed pawn is the best move. And for those of you that thought, well, why doesn't he just capture? That would be a blunder because it would allow queen to b4, pinning this rook to the king, and then the rook would be able to jump up, or the queen would be able to capture the rook next, and white would just be winning. So we go to g6 to block this attack on the h-pawn, and the game continues with c6 here, pushing the passed pawn. And that's usually a good idea, to push that pawn. And now, whenever you have a passed pawn, get that pawn moving. The closer it gets to the other side of the board, the bigger advantage you can gain. But just make sure if you push the pawn, you have enough pieces to protect it and back it up. So now black moves his king down into here to g7, an inaccuracy that gives a little more of an advantage to white. And it looks like the computer preferred rook to d8. So now we have a4 being played, and the computer prefers just queen to b4. So if we go back, queen to b4 would possibly allow the queen to jump up here to b7, attacking the black queen and helping to push this pawn forward after that black queen would have to move. So a4 and rook to d6 is played. And this is the game losing mistake here. Now it's +5 in white's favor. It looks like the computer wanted h5, which would still keep the game +1 in white's favor, but it wouldn't be quite losing, although I don't know, it probably would be close to losing because of this passed pawn anyway. So we have in the game rook to d6, the move that cost the game, because now we have queen to e5 check here. The king moved to f8, but this allows capture of the rook. And Capablanca's opponent resigned here because if we played it out further, after queen captures, we would have c7. And what does the king do? Maybe move away because he's too far away to come over and help stop this pawn. So, then there's just a promotion. And after that, the computer gives this move, but that allows a check of the king, and the queen's under attack. So, black would just be losing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little Capablanca Magic game here where we discuss chess strategy. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And feel free to leave comments, suggestions, or requests of any types of chess video you would like to see in the future. But as a recap, if you have a pawn majority, just remember to push. If we take a look at this and go back. So earlier we see that Capablanca had a pawn majority on the queen side, pushed the unopposed pawn, which is what he did here. And then if you get a passed pawn, which occurs later, always work to try and push that passed pawn, but just make sure it's backed up, which Capablanca did keep that pawn protected. and made it very difficult for his opponent. And also remember to give a little bit of air to your king if it's on the back rank so it could escape. But watch out for checks as well, which we saw here with this check on e5, causing the final problems and allowing Capablanca to win. Okay, everyone. Well, this was the second in this chess strategy series. So, I'll try and do some more of these and talk more about chess strategy. And hopefully that'll help you play better chess and win more games. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.